Yo, what up? Josh Rubin from East West Healing and Performance. Today I want to talk about Wilson syndrome. And the reason I want to talk about this is not because we're really working with clients that are diagnosed with this, so I don't want to feel like, that we're picking on clients here. We get a lot of calls every day from people that, want to work with us, and for many reasons, maybe they don't have the funds, maybe they're not the right fit, whatever it may be. But the most common thing I hear people say nowadays is, I think I have Wilson syndrome. I've actually been doing the research, or I've been diagnosed, and I really think I have the syndrome. And the problem is, it's kind of like PMS. I feel that it's actually a man-made disease. We put a name to it, we put a red tag around our neck, and we say we have Wilson syndrome. When we have Wilson syndrome, what we're really looking at is a conversion issue. As I've mentioned before, the body's always talking to us. The question is, are you actually tuning in and listening to what is going on? Do you understand your own physiology? So you understand when someone says you have Wilson syndrome, you need to take iodine, you need to take a glandular, or maybe you need to take T3 or Synthroid or T4T3, whatever it may be, that maybe you question that and you start to understand your physiology. You say, well, I don't really need that because this is really what's going on. Well, with Wilson syndrome, there's actually a conversion issue. So there's not really a dysfunction. There's actually more of a resistance to the T3 binding sites than anything. Because typically what happens, I got all my notes here in front of me. Typically what happens with Wilson syndrome is you have a T4 to T3 conversion that happens in the liver. Now, some people say about 10% of that happens in the thyroid through colloid production and breakdown and the release of thyroid hormones into the blood, which helps to regulate the HPT axis. And others say 70, 80, 90% of that other conversion happens peripherally in the liver. And I've talked about this before. So if the gut's overloaded, you're eating crappy foods, you're drinking a lot, you're estrogen dominant, anything that affects the liver directly or indirectly can overload the liver. Now the liver can't actually do what it's designed to do. So the liver is dependent on two different, we could say, things. We have glucose and selenium. Now, the liver has an enzyme, 5'-deodenase, and it's dependent on selenium to help with T4 to T3 conversion, to increase cellular energy production, to increase your body temperature, regulate metabolism, increase your immune system, increase thyroid production. At the same time, your liver is dependent on glucose to convert T4 to T3. Now, to make a long story short, anytime you're hypoglycemic, and I've talked about this before, I don't want to go into it again because I feel like I just repeat myself, the body releases excess cortisol and glucagon to increase blood sugar into the body through gluconeogenesis, which causes lipolysis, which is a huge problem in itself because it perpetuates the sympathetic response in the body through cortisol, glucagon, estrogen, and insulin. But the bottom line is this: excess cortisol actually can inhibit T4 to T3 conversion in the liver. Now, what happens is you actually get a conversion to reverse T3. Now, let's look at T4. I'm going to look at my notes from the metabolic blueprint here. T4 is considered a pre-hormone. It does very little until it's activated within the cells itself. T4 synthesizes from the amino acids tyrosine and iodine. Now, I'm not recommending you supplement with these, and this is why a lot of people actually supplement with iodine and tyrosine, because their T4 levels are low. But you actually need zinc, copper. So if you're iron excess, you're going to be copper deficient. So people that are copper deficient, zinc deficient, from being hydrochloric acid deficient, having a diet that's deficient in shellfish, they're not absorbing their minerals because their metabolism is slowed down, they're HCl deficient, they're vitamin A deficient, B2, B6, vitamin C deficient. All these things can actually decrease T4 production and lead to a conversion issue or lack of T3 production. So understand what's going on in your body before you take Synthroid, because Synthroid is an anti-hormone, and it's actually antagonistic to actually how the thyroid works by itself in the body when you take the medication itself. Now, as I mentioned, little of that's converted in the thyroid, and most of it's actually converted in the liver. Now, of course, there's more to it, but let's look at T3. T3 is actually considered the most metabolically active thyroid hormone, being 4 to 5 times more metabolically active than T4. Majority of it's bound to thyroid-binding globulin, and less than 1% of it's free T3. T3 is bound to albumin in the blood. Estrogen lowers albumin, that's why estrogen can lower T3. But at the same time, the availability of glucose in the body actually increases T3 production. That's why when people start eating fruits, root vegetables, which is basically sucrose, you actually get an upregulation of body temperature and a regulation of your pulse. Now what I'm getting at is this. If you don't get enough glucose, you can't produce T3. If you're producing excess cortisol to compensate for that lack of T3 production or the lack of glucose to make T3, the body compensates by doing that. That excess cortisol blocks T4 to T3 and you produce reverse T3. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to read a little bit here about reverse T3 from my notes. Cortisol inhibits T4 to T3 production, slowing your metabolism down, causing fatigue, suppressed immune system, gut problems, excess weight gain, edema, lowered body temperature, cold hands and feet, hypoglycemia, cravings, things like that. Cortisol diverts the focus of the cells from short-term stress. Insulin sensitivity increases the cells to burn more glucose, right, as I mentioned, giving your body a burst of energy to fight or flight. It thinks about short-term survival, not long-term needs. So it sacrifices those. When this happens, T4 is converted to reverse T3 because we don't have enough sugar or glucose, and the cortisol inhibits T4 to T3 production. So we actually get an increased production of reverse T3. The problem with reverse T3 is reverse T3 binds with your cells at the T3 receptor sites and the mitochondrial receptors in your cell because reverse T3 is weaker than T3. This actually slows energy production. And the bottom line is this. If you want to know if you're producing reverse T3, everyone says, well, what's a normal level? Some say less than 100, some say less than 30. Some say closer to 0. It's all personal preference based on the norms that you study. Really what I'm getting at is this. An easy way to know if you have Wilson syndrome, and this is common, or a conversion issue, you could even be regulating your temperatures. If your morning temperature is low, but during the day you're regulating it, let's say it's 97, 98, and then you eat your snack before bed, and then you wake up, it's 96, 97. That's typically a sign that at night you're not storing glycogen, you're producing excess cortisol. That's causing the increased conversion of T4 to reverse T3 instead of T3, which is increasing reverse T3, which is actually downregulating cell metabolism. So that's telling you that you actually have a conversion issue. At the same time, it could go a lot more deeper than this, but let's say you wake up with a 97 temperature and you don't get that change throughout the day. It's like 97.1 you eat, it's 97.2. It doesn't jump up a lot. That typically tells us that you're having a real bad conversion issue. Now, what can cause a conversion issue? Of course, this is YouTube. I can't go into depth as to why, for the next 20 minutes. But any type of estrogen dominance or progesterone deficiency can actually block the conversion of T4 to T3 and actually cause a conversion issue in itself because, as I mentioned, estrogen actually lowers albumin levels in the body, which affects blood volume and affects T3 production. But it also can block T4 to T3 production, and it can actually overload the liver. Fasting in itself, now when I say fasting, I just say you're not eating enough food and the right foods to meet your metabolic needs every given day. So that's fasting to me. And a lot of the times, if you're not doing that, you're becoming hypoglycemic, you produce excess cortisol, which is actually going to increase T4 to reverse T3 production. A chronic protein deficiency, because protein itself, non-inflammatory like broth, gelatin, eggs, dairy, whitefish, shellfish, you should be getting in the average Joe about 100 to 120 grams a day. Protein actually helps the liver detoxify estrogen. So if you're not getting enough protein, estrogen is going to build up, overload the liver. Now you're going to have a conversion issue, and you're going to have altered cellular metabolism. Overtraining of any kind, because most people become hypoglycemic. They're going into it hypometabolic. Their workouts are not planned. Their intensity reps, rests, sets, tempo, all that stuff it doesn't make sense. They're training too much. They're not taking enough rest periods. And they're becoming hypoglycemic. That produces excess cortisol. That produces excess glucagon, which is actually going to inhibit T4 to T3 production. And the best way to know this is 30 minutes after your workout, take your pulse, take your temperature. If your temperature is low, then you're in a hypometabolic state. You know that workout did not work for you. At the same time, if you take your pulse 30 minutes later and your pulse is over 85 beats a minute, you know that you're actually in a hyperadrenaline state, hypercortisol state, and that workout actually didn't work for you. You're actually breaking more muscle tissue down than you're actually quote-unquote building. Other things like endotoxin itself from any stress in the body will increase in the gut, overload the liver, increase estrogen circulation, which can actually inhibit T4 to T3 conversion. Any type of blood sugar dysregulation, as I talked about, could be not eating the right foods, not eating the right ratios, not eating the right frequencies, waiting too long between meals, overtraining, being stressed emotionally, not meeting your metabolic needs. Anytime you're hypoglycemic, the body basically compensates by pushing you hyperadrenaline, which causes hypercortisol. So it's just a compounding effect, which of course is going to inhibit T4 to T3 conversion. And of course, as I mentioned, any type of deficiency, it could be a vitamin A deficiency, vitamin C deficiency, vitamin B2, B6, copper deficiency. All these things can actually suppress T4 production and suppress a thyroid conversion to T3, which can actually cause a Wilson syndrome. So the bottom line is this: know what you're being diagnosed with. Don't just mark yourself with a diagnosis. Don't just take supplements without questioning what's going on, and at the same time without understanding your physiology. Because if you have Wilson's syndrome, it can be almost 99.9% fixed with food itself, eating the right digestible foods, the right ratios for your metabolic needs, the right frequencies for your metabolic needs, and altering all the other lifestyle, puzzle pieces to regulate metabolism. So hopefully you enjoyed this YouTube clip, and I'm out of here.